Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are opening up a file that is intensely personal, yes, but as we look closer, it really reveals a profoundly structural conflict.
That's right. We're moving beyond the immediate sort of surface drama of a public online confrontation.
Yeah, exactly. We're conducting a forensic deep dive into what the source material calls disparate conflict management strategies.
Right. Our sources here, and we have detailed expert analysis reports. We've got chronological breakdowns of communication, comparative case studies based on legal frameworks. They really compel us to analyze the behavior of one individual. She's referred to as Cybergirl 10 or CG10 in the documents.
And specifically across three simultaneous, very high-stakes disputes she was involved in.
Precisely.
So our mission today isn't really to focus on, who is right or wrong in the relationship outcome. Instead, we're looking at the architecture of her aggression. We need to analyze the specific channel, the content, and the context she chose for three different individuals. Her fiancé, Alberto, her lawyer, a Mr. Clinchies, and her ex-husband, who's referred to as Princess.
And the central question, that really the core paradox we have to grapple with, is one of psychological contradiction.
How so?
Well, CG10 demonstrated a clear, a functional capacity for appropriate, contained conflict resolution when she was dealing with these really severe legal and professional challenges. She knew how to handle it.
Okay.
Yet when she turned to her intimate partner, Alberto, she chose the most destructive path possible. We're talking public humiliation in a recorded, high-trust digital space.
So the sources are really pushing us to analyze this disparity, this difference in approach.
Exactly. We need to uncover why she chose maximum damage against the person who was arguably her greatest source of support at the time.
And also look at how the psychological mechanism of displaced aggression might explain this catastrophic failure of emotional regulation and, frankly, ethical judgment.
Okay, so let's unpack this conflict spectrum then, because understanding the conflict she managed, let's say it appropriately, is really crucial to understanding the one she managed catastrophically.
It absolutely is. The comparison is key.
So we have three recipients of this intense emotional energy. There's Alberto, her fiancé, described as a highly visible community leader.
Right.
Then Mr. Crinchies, the legal professional overseeing a critical divorce proceeding for her. And finally, Princess, her ex-husband, involved in asset division, alimony disputes. As sources describe him as pathologically difficult.
Yeah, that context is important. And what stands out immediately when you look at the analysis is this difference between the severity of the grievance she had
Right.
and the discipline of her response. Because the grievances against the lawyer and the ex-husband were, you could argue, structurally more significant.
How do you mean? Well, they dealt with her legal freedom, her financial future through asset division, and potentially the well-being of her children stemming from the divorce outcome. Huge stakes.
Okay, massive stakes.
Yet, those conflicts were managed with remarkable discipline. Contained.
Right. Let's detail those contained disputes then, starting with Mr. Cringes, the professional dispute.
Okay, so this wasn't just a minor disagreement, like a missed deadline. This was framed as a complete failure of professional duty by her lawyer, causing extreme personal suffering.
How so? What happened?
CG10 was dealing with intense frustration because her lawyer had, well, effectively vanished during a critical phase of her divorce. The source material notes he was unresponsive, no phone calls returned, no emails answered, for approximately 4 months.
Wow, 4 months of silence during a divorce proceeding. That's not just like bad customer service. That induces intense feelings of anxiety, abandonment, a deep sense of financial and personal vulnerability, especially when kids are involved, right?
Exactly right. And the source material explicitly links this professional negligence to intense financial and mental health impacts on her and her dependents. So the content of her dispute was a formal complaint about professional incompetence and severe limiting of communication, essentially detailing malpractice.
Okay, so a really serious grievance. But the channel she chose for this, the way she communicated this grievance that was basically paralyzing her ability to move forward legally, that was entirely appropriate.
Entirely. It was contained within a private letter or email, addressed probably to the firm, maybe a regulatory body. She followed protocol.
So the criticism was severe, it sounds like it was justified, but it was focused purely on his professional conduct.
Precisely. She chose to address the breach of professional trust through professional means. She respected the necessary boundaries of, due process and client confidentiality. This shows control. It shows she understood the rules of that particular game.
And that discipline, that control, it continues into the second contained dispute, the one with Princess, the ex-husband.
It does. And the emotional stakes here were arguably even higher. We're talking about dealing with someone described as a narcissistic, potentially abusive ex-spouse during the really messy final stages of asset division.
That sounds incredibly stressful.
The sources highlight the profound emotional toll. This type of high-conflict divorce, especially with someone described as pathologically inflexible, reinforces feelings of being trapped, powerless.
Yeah.
It can even induce symptoms akin to PTSD.
So what was the conflict content there? What were they actually fighting about?
It was largely transactional, according to the reports. Demands regarding the sale of a shared asset, specifically a caravan is mentioned, and arguing over finances, what the sources term a shitty deal regarding alimony or asset division. Standard messy divorce stuff, but intensely personal.
And the channels used here, how did she communicate those demands?
Again, private, text messages, maybe voice calls, and crucially her communications, while definitely demanding and probably quite forceful, they still demonstrated a respect for the legal boundaries. The analysis notes she specifically directed him to contact his legal counsel.
So she was reinforcing that this was a legal matter, needing formal channels, not just a personal shouting match.
Exactly. She wasn't trying to litigate it via text message warfare. She was pointing him back to the established process, due process.
So the key takeaway then, comparing these two disputes, the lawyer and the ex-husband, it seems pretty clear. CG10, even under extreme, almost unbearable stress,
Right.
demonstrated a capacity for quite sophisticated conflict management. When faced with these powerful sort of system-level opponents, the legal system via the lawyer, the transactional system via the ex-husband, she contained her aggression, kept it within defined, private, appropriate channels.
It wasn't that she lacked the rage. I mean, the sources make it clear the rage was immense, the frustration was palpable.
Right.
It was that she recognized, consciously or unconsciously, that breaching those boundaries, going public or getting personal in the wrong way, would actually harm her own legal standing and complicate her life even further.
So she understood the cost of public disclosure and chaos when the conflict was transactional or professional. She could weigh the consequences.
Yes. She demonstrated that ability to weigh consequences and choose the strategically sound path, even when furious.
Okay. And this brings us then to the stark contrast, the unique case of Alberto, the weaponization of the public forum. The source analysis shows that in this instance, she basically disregarded every single boundary she had so carefully respected in the other two cases.
Absolutely. The channel violation here is really the core of the harm analysis. The confrontation didn't happen privately, didn't happen through lawyers. It occurred in a public recorded X space.
Which the sources describe as a digital campfire. Can you explain that? Why is that specific environment so important here?
We really need to pause and understand why this environment made the violation so uniquely damaging. It wasn't just any public forum.
Okay. Tell us about the environment. What were the core tenets of Alberto's community space?
This was apparently a unique blend. It mixed technical expertise, discussions about tech or industry topics,
Right.
with deep personal vulnerability. Alberto's spaces, according to the analysis, operated on principles of radical inclusion and, crucially, non-judgment.
And his guiding philosophy, the sources quote it.
Yes, his stated philosophy, which kind of served as the unwritten community constitution, was no opino, no juzgo, escucho a todos, which translates to I don't opine, I don't judge, I listen to all.
So people felt comfortable, even encouraged to share deeply personal struggles. Things like PTSD, ongoing legal battles, mental health challenges.
Precisely, because they believed the space was safe, supportive, and importantly, non-exploitable. They trusted Alberto and the community he fostered.
So this high degree of shared vulnerability and trust created a kind of social contract within that digital space.
Exactly. A very specific, high-trust social contract. And CG10's public ambush, her decision to air private, intimate relationship grievances in that specific venue.
It shattered that contract.
Shattered it. Not just for Alberto, but potentially for every single person who had participated in that space, who had shared their own vulnerabilities believing it was safe. It transformed a trusted sanctuary into an instrument of personal torture, basically overnight.
The sources detail the timeline. Alberto recognized the transgression almost immediately, didn't he? He tried to de-escalate, set a boundary.
Yes, he attempted to protect both the community and the relationship by offering a reasonable, private path forward. He publicly stated something like he would move the conversation to a private channel in an hour.
Which seems like a clear effort to respect the forum's norms and also his own relationship boundaries. Take the fight offline.
Exactly. It was a boundary-setting move.
Hmm.
But her public rejection of that offer, that's highlighted in the analysis as a really key regarding her intent.
The demand, call me now, publicly.
Yes. That controlling demand, call me now, publicly, in front of everyone. It clearly signaled a prioritization of her immediate need for validation, or maybe public leverage, over any respect for his boundaries, the community's norms, or even the relationship itself.
It effectively turned the audience, the listeners in that space, into an enforced jury for their private dispute.
Absolutely. And the transgression was so immediate, so obvious, that observers in the live chat apparently confirmed the violation in real time. The sources cite comments like, "Are we witnessing a domestic dispute?" And people noting that the venue was clearly inappropriate for airing custody issues or relational strife.
So the community itself recognized this wasn't right.
Yes, that community validation, or rather condemnation, confirms her rejection of the shared social contract was deliberate and visible to everyone present. It wasn't, a private argument that accidentally spilled out.
No, it sounds like a deliberate deployment of a private dispute into a highly trusted public arena precisely to maximize shame and control.
That's the conclusion the analysis reaches.
So, okay, we've established the channel violation, the public nature of the attack. Now we need to transition to the why. What was the psychological engine driving this specific, uniquely destructive choice?
Right. And to understand the why, we have to start with the immense, almost unbearable pressure cooker CG-10 was apparently managing at that time. The sources define this as the crisis nexus.
This cumulative stress load, it sounds astronomical. We talked about the legal issues, the lawyer, Mr. Cringy, is being unresponsive for 4 months. Psychologically, what does that do to someone?
Well, it generates intense frustration, obviously, anxiety. But the analysis points to its most critical output being a feeling of structural powerlessness.
Structural powerlessness. Explain that.
She wasn't just fighting an identifiable antagonist, like a difficult person she could argue with directly. She was fighting a silent, immovable professional system, the legal system, represented by the unresponsive lawyer. It's a system designed to be slow, often opaque, and largely immune to immediate emotional confrontation.
That's a really powerful distinction. When you confront a person, you might get a reaction, maybe even resolution. But confronting an unresponsive system...
You just get helplessness, silence. Confronting professional negligence is functionally impossible in the immediate term. You can write a letter, file a complaint, but the system doesn't scream back at you. It just remains silent or slow, which just compounds the feeling of being utterly powerless.
Okay, so that's one major stressor generating powerlessness.
Then layer on top of that what the sources call narcissistic entrapment of dealing with the ex-husband, Princess. His described pathological inflexibility in the divorce proceedings that reinforces those feelings of being perpetually trapped, unable to control her own destiny or finances within that legal structure.
So she's feeling powerless against the legal system and powerless against her ex-husband's difficult behavior within that system.
Exactly. So you have this immense anger, this acute frustration building up from these sources, this silent lawyer, the immovable ex, and has no appropriate or effective outlet. They're too powerful to confront directly, or they're literally inaccessible, like the silent lawyer.
So the anger becomes like a volatile entity.
Precisely. It has to go somewhere. And this is where the analysis brings in the textbook psychological mechanism of displaced aggression.
Okay.
The intense system-generated rage gets redirected. It's shunted away from the original inaccessible sources.
And aimed toward a safer, more accessible target.
Exactly.
Right.
And often the most emotionally reliable target, the person whose reaction you can count on.
And in this case, that target was Alberto. Now, let's address a potential critique here. Why was Alberto the safest target? Surely confronting her fiancé publicly seems risky.
He was safe in the psychological sense, not necessarily the relational one. Safe because he was intimate and presumably supportive up to that point. The silent legal system offered no emotional return, no catharsis. The ex-husband offered conflict, yes, but perhaps escalated things in ways she couldn't control or didn't provide the specific type of emotional release she craved.
But Alberto
was accessible. He was emotionally invested. And critically, his high emotional investment, combined with the public nature of the attack, almost guaranteed the aggressor would receive a powerful, immediate, and public response or reaction.
So in her state of structural powerlessness, she needed a guaranteed win, a guaranteed
A
reaction.
guaranteed impacts,
Ah.
a way to feel powerful, even if destructively so. Displaced aggression functions, temporarily, to restore a sense of emotional equilibrium for the aggressor, because it allows them to exert power over something, to make something react, even if it's the wrong thing and the power is harmful. The public platform amplified that impact.
The analysis explicitly states the attack on Alberto was objectively out of proportion to the perceived trigger, his withdrawal, his ghosting, as she might have seen it.
Yes. The sources conclude the attack wasn't really about the ghosting itself, not in proportion anyway. It was structurally necessitated by her powerlessness elsewhere. She was attacking Alberto because he was the only available valve left to release the immense pressure built up by the lawyer and the ex-husband.
That reframes it significantly.
It does. It moves from angry outburst to a sort of systemic failure of emotional regulation spilling onto the nearest, most vulnerable target.
Okay, but this shift from what might be seen as a trauma response to what the sources frame as targeted manipulation, this is where a very sharp line gets drawn, isn't it? Specifically regarding the introduction of sensitive private matters involving a minor child.
This is the point the analysis identifies as the irrevocable ethical line in the sand. The moment she brought the child into the public conflict. The conflict stopped being just about their relationship dynamics, however messy. It became a direct violation of a child's fundamental right to privacy and safety. She weaponized deeply sensitive custody and visitation information in front of a public recorded audience.
Let's reiterate the specific quote cited, just for clarity on the severity. She publicly challenged Alberto, saying something like, "Do you think that it's okay that you tell me that I have 5 minutes time to talk to my 11-year-old girl when they come home after 2 weeks?"
Yes, and the analysis considers this an act of profound or permanent ethical violation. By making these specifics public, the child's age, the exact nature of the visitation conflict, in a recorded, shareable forum,
She created a permanent digital footprint.
an irreparable and permanent harm to the privacy of a non-consenting minor, is how the analysis puts it. That record is searchable, it's indexed by search engines, it will exist long after this specific drama fades. It could impact the child's future digital identity, their social life, their emotional well-being, in ways we can't even predict.
And the sources note that someone else in the space, a co-host named Cindy, recognized the gravity immediately.
Yes, apparently she intervened, saying something like, let's drop it just because I heard a kid involved, so yeah, let's not anymore.
That immediate third-party intervention really underscores that this wasn't just awkward relationship stuff. It was recognized in real time as crossing a serious ethical line, a societal transgression.
It moved beyond relationship strife into actively endangering a minor's digital privacy and potentially their emotional safety.
Okay. And furthermore, the analysis argues this wasn't just random venting about the child, it was a targeted violation, specifically weaponizing Alberto's intimate vulnerability.
Yes. The source material is quite clear that CG10 was explicitly aware, or should have been aware, that Alberto was already struggling significantly. The terms used are severe mental health issues and that he was emotionally struggling badly.
And his coping mechanism, the withdrawal or ghosting that might have triggered her outburst, was likely an external sign of an internal collapse, maybe a depressive state where he was simply overwhelmed.
That's a plausible interpretation based on the description. And in any intimate relationship, but especially when one partner is actively managing a severe mental health crisis, there's an implied, almost fiduciary duty of care.
A responsibility to support and, critically, to avoid knowingly inflicting further harm.
Precisely. And the analysis concludes CG10 violated this duty catastrophically and intentionally.
How is it intentional?
By using the child's custody details, a topic likely central to his identity, his stress, his role as a father, to attack him specifically on his parental role. She struck precisely at his deepest known vulnerability.
Wow.
This is the definition of weaponizing a partner's vulnerability for maximal psychological pain. It's a calculated act. It transforms the relationship, which should be a supportive buffer, into a source of acute, intentional trauma.
And when intimacy itself, the knowledge you gain through closeness, is used as the basis for public shaming and exposure.
The dynamic aligns perfectly with severe emotional abuse. It creates what psychologists term betrayal trauma, where the person or institution you depend on for safety becomes the source of danger or harm. The damage is profound.
This specific case, while obviously devastating for the individuals involved, it really does serve as a kind of template for this type of digital relational aggression, doesn't it?
It does. It follows a depressingly familiar pattern.
So we need to broaden the lens now and look at how the legal and psychological systems try to categorize this behavior and often fail to provide effective remedies. Let's generalize the structural anatomy of the conflict first.
Okay. The archetype we see holds true across many online conflicts, not just intimate ones. You have hostility originating from an inaccessible or overwhelming source of stress. That's party A's structural powerlessness, CG10's stress from the lawyer and X.
Right.
That hostility is then channeled through a public entity, the X space, a social media platform, a review site, whatever.
And aimed at harming a primary target. Alberto's reputation, his status, his emotional well-being.
Exactly. Party A uses entity B to harm Party C.
And the internet, specifically social media platforms like X Spaces, they seem almost perfectly designed to facilitate this kind of displacement, don't they? Why is it so much more effective or tempting than, say, standing on a street corner and yelling?
Several reasons. First, they offer a low-risk environment for hostility, at least initially. The aggressor often doesn't face immediate, physical, or even direct social repercussions in the same way they might offline. There's a layer of detachment.
Anonymity or pseudonymity helps too, sometimes.
Sometimes, yes. But even when identified, the platform itself acts as an accelerant. The aggressor, seeking validation for their rage, can often find echo chambers or toxic communities online who will cheer them on, justify the attack, reinforce their narrative of victimhood.
Ah, so the platform isn't just a neutral channel.
No, the platform's algorithms, the social dynamics within it, can become a feedback loop. It turns the entire digital sphere into an integral part of the psychological weapon, solidifying the behavior, making the aggressor feel righteous in a way face-to-face conflict rarely does.
Okay, now let's turn to the legal challenges. Because the obvious first reaction for any victim of this kind of public shaming is probably, I need to sue for defamation.
Right.
Get this damaging stuff taken down.
That's the immediate instinct, yes.
But the sources explain why defamation law often just collapses in these specific kinds of relational disputes. Why is that?
It comes down to what lawyers often call the truth problem, or sometimes the opinion problem. Defamation law, generally speaking, requires proving a false statement of fact that harms someone's reputation.
False statement of fact, that's the key.
That's the key. But aggressors engaging in this kind of displaced relational aggression rarely rely on pure, provable falsehoods. Instead, they weaponize other things: extremely harsh language, subjective opinions, or critically true but damaging private facts.
Like the custody issue here, however maliciously it was intended or framed, there likely was some underlying disagreement about visitation time. It wasn't fabricated out of whole cloth.
Precisely. If the core statement is technically true, we disagreed about call times. Or, if it can be reasonably framed as subjective opinion, I feel he's neglecting his duties, versus he is legally neglectful. The defamation claim often falls apart instantly.
Leaving the victim where?
High and dry, legally speaking, at least regarding defamation. They're then forced to rely on much more complex torts, like intentional infliction of emotional distress, which carry an astronomically higher burden of proof.
The analysis offers a really interesting parallel here. Professional proxy attacks. Can you expand on that? How does a personal feud get laundered into a professional reputation assault?
Yeah, we see this quite a bit in commercial litigation or employment disputes. A disgruntled business partner, an ex-employee, someone holds a deep personal grudge. But instead of confronting the person directly about the personal issue, they redirect the hostility toward the target's source of livelihood or public standing. They might place fake or maybe just vindictively negative reviews on business platforms like Yelp or Google. They might spread rumors about the person's professional incompetence or ethical lapses, often framed just carefully enough to avoid strict defamation.
So the content of the attack, the negative review, the rumor, targets the target's status or their business.
Right.
Even though the root cause is a deeply personal feud that has nothing to do with their professional competence.
Exactly. And in Alberto's case, his high status as a community leader, his reputation built on that no opino, no juzgo philosophy. That was his professional standing and identity within that specific digital sphere.
So the attack wasn't just random yelling. It was strategically designed to humiliate him in that domain.
Precisely. To impair his ability to function as that trusted leader, to inflict a severe psychic wound linked directly to the loss of that specific status and self-esteem. The choice of channel, the X space where he held that status, was the weapon targeting his specific professional and personal identity in that community.
Okay, so When defamation fails, because the content isn't strictly false, or its opinion, victims have to pivot. They look at the tort of intentional infliction of emotional distress, IIED.
Hmm.
And this is where the legal hurdles become, as the sources suggest, nearly insurmountable in many cases.
They really do. The standard for IIED in most jurisdictions is incredibly demanding. You typically have to prove the conduct meets the extreme and outrageous standard.
Extreme and outrageous, what does that actually mean in legal terms?
It means the conduct has to go beyond all possible bounds of decency and be regarded as atrocious and utterly intolerable in a civilized community. It's a very high bar.
That sounds almost impossible to clear for many domestic disputes, even really ugly public ones. What kind of behavior does meet that standard in legal precedent? Give us an example.
Well, historically, courts reserve IIED for truly heinous acts. Think about cases involving, say, prolonged high-level stalking that puts someone in genuine fear for their life. Or maybe public desecration of a deceased family member's grave specifically to torment the survivors. Or persistent, life-threatening abuse.
Okay, really extreme stuff.
Yes. In one famous precedent, for instance, a court found IIED when an employer, knowing an employee had recently lost a child, knowingly and repeatedly harassed that employee about the deceased child over a period of months, specifically to cause pain. The conduct has to be so vile, so beyond the pale, that a reasonable person hearing the facts would spontaneously exclaim, outrageous.
So, while the calculated public shaming of a mentally vulnerable partner using private family details is emotionally horrific
Absolutely horrific.
and causes verifiable psychological harm, anxiety, severe distress, maybe even PTSD symptoms,
Undeniably.
the legal system often views it as just a really messy domestic issue, bad behavior, but not rising to that level of intolerable in a civilized society.
That is often the outcome, unfortunately. That's the critical disparity the analysis points out. The victim experiences profound, potentially life-altering psychological harm, but the legal standard for IIED was historically designed for different kinds of transgressions, often more physical or immediately threatening.
So it leaves this massive gap in remedy. Digital relational aggression that uses true but maliciously framed private facts to inflict deep emotional wounds. It often falls right into that gap.
Exactly. The law struggles to capture the sheer emotional toxicity and calculated cruelty of displaced aggression, unless it involves clear threats, provable lies under the defamation standard, or conduct that reaches that extremely high IIE bar.
And even if a victim thinks they might clear the IED hurdle or they have a defamation claim, the procedural hurdles of online conflict can become strategic weapons themselves, used by the defendant.
Oh, absolutely. This is a huge issue in digital cases. We're dealing with potentially transnational digital platforms. The act of posting the conduct might occur in state A where the aggressor lives.
Right.
But the injury, the reputation damage, the emotional distress is felt by the victim in state B where they live and work.
Which creates complex jurisdictional questions. Where do you even file the lawsuit?
Precisely. This complexity means the aggressor, or more likely their lawyer, can strategically deploy jurisdictional challenges to try and get the case dismissed or moved.
What kind of challenges?
They might argue forum nonconvenience, basically saying the chosen court is inconvenient and it should be heard elsewhere, maybe where the defendant lives. Or they'll challenge whether the defendant has sufficient minimum contacts with the victim state to even be sued there.
Minimum contacts. How do courts figure that out for online stuff? The sources mentioned the Zippo test.
Yeah, the Zippo test is a framework courts sometimes use, though its application is evolving. It basically places websites on a spectrum. At one end, you have passive sites just posting information, like an online brochure. Those usually don't establish jurisdiction elsewhere. At the other end, you have active commercial websites where users conduct business, like Amazon. Those clearly do establish jurisdiction where their customers are.
And where does something like an X space or a social media platform fall?
Usually somewhere in the middle. They're highly interactive, users generate content, but they aren't always purely commercial in the traditional sense. So it becomes arguable.
And the defense lawyer argues.
They argue the platform's global. The poster maybe didn't specifically target residents of the victim's state, so there aren't enough minimum contacts to justify jurisdiction there. This can turn what should be a relatively straightforward tort case about harmful speech into a complex, expensive battle over constitutional law and civil procedure.
So it becomes a tactic.
It's often a deliberate tactic. It strategically exhausts the victim's resources. The cost of fighting these jurisdictional motions briefing hearings can quickly dwarf the potential recovery in the original relational dispute. It's a way to bully the victim into dropping the case through financial exhaustion.
That's incredibly cynical. But it's important to clarify, right, that despite all these hurdles, the First Amendment in the U.S. doesn't just give people a free pass to harass others online.
No, absolutely not. That's a common misconception. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech, but it does not protect criminal behavior like true threats or stalking, nor does it shield genuine harassment or defamation that meets the relevant legal standards.
So it doesn't protect the targeted, intentional use of public forums specifically to inflict harm.
Not if that harm rises to the level of an unprotected category of speech, like defamation or a true threat, or meets the IIED standard. However, the legal necessity remains the same. The prosecution or the plaintiff still has to prove the elements of the claim. And crucially, for things like IIED or harassment statutes, they often have to prove the defendant's specific intent to harass or inflict severe distress.
And proving intent is notoriously difficult.
It's a much higher evidentiary bar than simply proving the act caused distress. Proving what was inside someone's head when they posted something, that remains the critical challenge in many of these cases.
Okay, so we've dissected the capacity for controlled conflict resolution, CG10 showed, with the lawyer and the ex-husband. We've analyzed the psychological engine, this displaced aggression fueled by structural powerlessness. And we've examined the legal vacuum that often fails to adequately address this specific kind of digital relational violence. Let's try and bring it all together now. What's the final synthesis, the core takeaway regarding the calculated nature of the harm against Alberto?
The synthesis offered by the analysis is pretty unequivocal, actually. CG10 proved, through her contrasting actions with Mr. Cream Cheese and Princess, that she fully understood the necessity and possessed the capability for private, contained conflict resolution, even under immense pressure.
She knew the rules.
She knew the rules and could follow them when it suited her strategic interests, like protecting her legal standing. Therefore, her choice to deploy the most destructive, the most public, and the most ethically compromising attack, using that specific public venue and exposing the minor's private life, specifically against Alberto.
It confirms it wasn't just an accident, an emotional slip-up.
No. The analysis concludes it confirms this was a calculated strategy, a conscious, or at least functionally conscious, decision to maximize force and public shame against the one relationship where she perhaps felt she could successfully leverage power and enforce immediate compliance or reaction.
As a way to alleviate those intense, unmanageable feelings of powerlessness she felt in her other, more intractable legal disputes.
Exactly. The weaponization was precise. Using intimacy, using his known fragility, using the public platform where he held status, all to guarantee a significant damaging result.
And the consequence of that calculated act, it's not temporary. The sources stress this is long-term and irreversible harm.
Yes, the damage described falls into several categories, all severe and enduring. First, there's the public, permanent humiliation, the creation of that searchable digital artifact of his private shame and vulnerability that will follow him indefinitely online.
Right, the digital footprint.
Second, the analysis points to profound betrayal trauma. Experiencing this kind of attack from your most intimate partner, the person who should be your source of safety and support, especially when you're already vulnerable. It's akin to PTSD in its impact. It fundamentally destroys the foundation of trust and safety required for any healthy, intimate partnership.
And when a partner is knowingly targeted like this, especially while already struggling with severe mental health issues, the relationship itself stops being a haven, doesn't it?
It becomes an active trauma vector. It becomes dangerous. The analysis suggests that recovery necessitates treating this event not merely as a relationship fight that went too far, but as a significant psychological assault.
Given that assessment, psychological assault, and Alberto's documented existing vulnerability, what are the necessary recommendations that come out of the source analysis for his recovery?
For Alberto, the recommendations are stark. Immediate and absolute physical and emotional space is deemed mandatory. Separation is presented as a necessary condition for him to even begin recovering from the acute psychological trauma and to stabilize his severe mental health crisis.
So distance is step one.
Distance and safety. And crucially, CG10 must rigorously respect those boundaries. She must cease the demand withdrawal cycle that likely characterized the conflict, as continuing that pattern only compounds his distress and reinforces the trauma. Recovery for him has to focus on regaining a sense of personal control and emotional safety away from the source of the trauma.
Okay. And for CG10, the aggressor in this specific incident, What does necessary accountability look like based on the source analysis?
The recommendations reported in the sources stress the need for mandatory urgent individual therapy for her, and it needs to be focused on two critical areas.
Which are?
First, developing genuine emotional regulation skills, learning how to manage the chronic stress coming from her external legal battles and the conflict with her ex-husband without resorting to harmful displacement.
Okay, learn to handle her own stress.
And second, directly confronting and fundamentally abandoning the use of abusive tactics, specifically public shaming, manipulation, and the weaponization of a partner's vulnerability as a means of trying to control situations where she feels powerless. She needs to develop constructive ways to process her own structural trauma instead of transferring her immense rage onto intimate partners.
So accountability involves deep personal work on her part.
Significant work focused on emotional regulation and breaking abusive patterns, yes.
All right, that brings us toward wrapping up. Let's offer a final thought for you, the listener. Based on everything we've explored today, we've seen quite clearly, I think, that CG10's public conflict with Alberto was fundamentally different from her contained conflicts with the lawyer and the ex-husband.
Yes, not just different in emotional volume or intensity, but different in its calculated intent and severity.
The key differentiating factor, according to the analysis, was the deliberate violation of a high-trust, vulnerable channel, that digital campfire, and the calculated weaponization of private, sensitive family information for maximum psychological effect against an already vulnerable person.
And the analysis clearly shows that the greatest harm in these kinds of digital relational conflicts is often the severe, lasting emotional distress and the creation of that permanent, damaging public record.
Yet, as we discussed, the legal system really struggles to provide adequate remedy. Defamation often fails because of the truth problem or the opinion defense.
And the bar for intentional infliction of emotional distress, that extreme and outrageous standard, is just so incredibly high, almost impossible for many of these cases to meet.
So, we leave you, our listener, with this provocative question to think about. Given this demonstrated gap between the very real, often permanent digital psychological injury caused by this kind of behavior and the high legal bars for remedy, what comes next? What new societal standards, maybe new ethical protocols for governing digital community spaces, or perhaps even new technological mechanisms might be required? How do we hold people accountable for malicious, calculated digital cruelty, even when the specific content falls just short of tort law's current, demanding extreme and outrageous threshold?
It's a critical question for our increasingly online lives. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the architecture of displaced aggression in the digital public square.
Until next time.